we want to talk about today is it's a sobering subject, and we appreciate you guys being here for the discussion of the sanctity of life. It is indeed a matter of life and death that we are addressing. And one of the reasons we're doing this here is because, in our view, we don't hear about this in our churches very often. Let me take a show of hands here, just among all of you out there. How many of you have heard in the church that you attend, whether it's here or at home, say in the last year, anything about abortion, preached or talked about from up front? Okay? I don't see too many hands. That's about what I expected. I ask my Talbot students who are trained to be pastors, how many of them know when the Sanctity of Life Sunday is? And hardly any hands go up, which suggests that there's just not a lot of discussion about this in our churches and why we wanted to bring this here. Now, here's some of the reasons this is important, is because in the culture today, there is still a general erosion of respect for essential human dignity, especially life at the margins, at the beginning and at the end of life. There are still roughly, in the latest studies that have come out for the year 2010 that were just recently published, 1.1 million abortions in the United States taking place annually, and no overturning of Roe v. Wade that legalized abortion in 1973 is likely. Probably in our lifetime we won't see that. Now, that being said, there's also a really significant grassroots pro-life movement across the country, and I think technology is actually helping the pro-life cause of the unborn today. It has become increasingly more difficult in light of the technological advances that enable obstetricians and gynecologists to look inside the womb, especially things like the 4D ultrasound. It's become increasingly difficult to say that the unborn child is simply a product of conception or a piece of tissue analogous to a liver or a kidney. But the main reason this is important, there's two recent trends that I find really troubling and I am very interesting across the landscape on this. One is that abortion rights advocates are increasingly conceding what technology is making more obvious, that the unborn child is a full person with the corresponding rights to life. However, they are also advancing the argument that women have the right to end the lives of their full person unborn children based on their choice. Now, in my view, if we think about that just a little bit, in my view, it seems to me once you actually concede that the unborn child is a person, then I think it makes the argument for abortion rights much more difficult to sustain. Take, for example, go back to when my wife and when our kids were very young. Say they were, say we had two children, a year old and a newborn, and we just needed a break and we had to get away. Imagine that instead of calling our parents for help or our neighbors for help watching children, we just stacked up some bottles and some diapers and patted them on the head and decided we're going to Hawaii for 2 weeks. Okay? Who do you think would have been likely to meet us on our return from Hawaii? Okay? Besides angry relatives and grandparents, it would have been Child Protective Services, the police, and we would certainly have gone to jail for child abandonment and neglect, at the least. Now, why is that true? Why would we have been charged with that? The reason is because our children have a claim on us for what they need to survive and flourish. And it seems to me that once we concede that the unborn child is a person, not only is it really difficult to make a case for abortion rights, we can also make an argument that unborn children actually have a claim on the mother's body for the things that they need to flourish. Okay? Here's a second trend that I think is really disturbing. And that is that infanticide is now being euphemized or is referred to now as a euphemism called the after-birth abortion. The picture on the screen there is the Philadelphia abortion clinic of Dr. Kermit Gosnell, who was recently, just this last year, was both indicted and later convicted for 7 cases of infanticide. Where, as the grand jury reported, children either as they were coming out of the birth canal or in most cases after they were born, he simply snipped the spinal cord of these recently born children. One commentator puts it like this: These cases are enough to sicken anyone. The baby he delivered alive at 7.5 months, for instance, and then snipped its spinal cord, packed it in a shoebox, and joked that it was so big it could, quote, walk me to the bus stop. A 28-week-old fetus whose corpse was discovered in a clinic packed in a frozen water bottle was another. The baby who lived for more than 20 minutes before the assistant finally came in and cut the spinal cord just the way she had seen Gosnell do it many times. The grand jury report alleges hundreds of cases like this in that clinic. One clinic employee admitted to severing the spinal cords of roughly 100 babies, each beyond 24 weeks gestational age. At about the same time that this trial was going down, the Journal of Medical Ethics, one of the most prestigious bioethics journals in the world, published the first of a series of symposium articles on the moral justification for afterbirth abortions. The authors argue that what we call afterbirth abortion should be permissible in all cases where abortion is, including cases where the newborn is not disabled. That strikes me as a very, very powerful and dangerous trend. And this is a baby, for example, the picture was taken from the neonatal intensive care unit at roughly born at 23 weeks gestation. It was babies that size that were being victimized by infanticide at places like Dr. Gosnell's clinic. Now finally, just to think about this, the question this raises is, should the unborn be taken as members of the human community? I would suggest that this is not fundamentally a scientific question. Science can tell us what an unborn child is in terms of its anatomy and physiology. It can tell us that it's living and that it's human, but it can't tell us what kind of a thing it is metaphysically and philosophically. That's a question for philosophy and theology. I actually had a scientist concede this to me at one point. I nearly fell out of my chair when he did. But the conclusion that he drew after that was that if science doesn't answer the question, then one person's opinion is as good as the next. And then that's not helpful either. And there are philosophical and theological reasons that we can make for appreciating and regarding the unborn as a full member of the human community. Theologically, the Bible's really clear that abortion is stopping the creative and intimate handiwork of God in the womb. That God, Psalm 139 makes it very clear that God is at work shaping and molding and intricately weaving unborn children together in their mother's womb. And abortion, the old bumper sticker that abortion stops a beating heart is true. It's also true that abortion stops the handiwork of God in the womb. Abortion is also killing a member of the human community, which I think the Bible takes that very seriously with its admonitions about not taking innocent life since it is made in God's image. This really came home to me, the import of this came home to me when I was a doctoral student years ago at the University of Southern California. I had a doctoral student that I had gotten to know. I wouldn't say we had become close friends because we disagreed on just about everything in our field that we studied. I actually can't think of somebody like that who I disagreed more frequently and vociferously with than this person. But toward the end of our classwork together, he committed what was at the time almost an unpardonable sin in our department. He was a TA for an undergraduate class for one of the distinguished professors in the department, and he got emotionally involved with one of the students that he was TAing for. That's a major no-no. But it was also heightened by the fact that they had made plans to get married. They had just recently got engaged, and she was when I heard about this, she was about 3 months pregnant. Major no-nos for TAs. And all of a sudden on a Monday morning, we came into class, and he looked like he'd been run over by a train. And we asked him, what happened? And he said, over the weekend, his girlfriend had both broken their engagement, ended their relationship, and ended the pregnancy. And he looked at, there were a couple of us that were talking to him, and he made this really striking comment. He said, you know what? You pro-life guys were right. He said, because what she did was not just take out a piece of tissue. She killed my child. And he was just crestfallen, devastated by this. And I think he got what a lot of us intuitively sense, that what goes on in abortion is something very different than the way it's portrayed in a lot of the media today. I'll turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. Well, why have a communication professor speak at a pro-life chapel? Because Paul would say in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, you're all ambassadors for Christ. All of you have the responsibility of speaking for God. Paul puts it this way, it's as though God were speaking through you as you interact with people as God's ambassador. It doesn't matter what your major is. You are called to be his representative. So that brings up two very powerful questions in light of everything that Dr. Ray just shared. First, how should we view those seeking an abortion? That's incredibly important. How do we view the very people that we would seek to persuade with God's truth? We have a concept in comm theory called cognitive complexity. Cognitive complexity asks one simple question. How many interpretations do you have of a person's actions? Right? So if your roommate comes home late and you were making dinner, how many interpretations do you have of that person's lateness will really dictate your response. So when we think of a woman walking into an abortion clinic, we have to ask the question, how many interpretations do we have of what she is doing? Now hear me when I say this. I believe that every time an abortion happens, a life is taken, but I do not believe that it's always premeditated murder in the mind of the woman doing the abortion. Why? She may be clinically depressed heading into that clinic. She may be being forced to get an abortion, even against her will, her desires, by her boyfriend or by her husband. She may feel deep shame, even shame at the church, having an unwanted premarital pregnancy. So when we look at these women, we must have compassion. That compassion will be fueled by looking at this woman and asking a question, what is the motivation that she's going to get this abortion? If we're just locked in on one interpretation, that this woman knows the fetus is human and she doesn't care, she just wants to get rid of this problem, then I think our response will be anger and unsympathetic hearts towards that person. Do I think some women have that attitude heading into an abortion clinic? I don't care whether the unborn is human or not, I just want this to go away? Yes, but to have a compassionate response, we must think deeply about all the multitude of reasons why a woman would have an abortion, and Dr. Anderson is going to tackle some of that at the end of this presentation. Second question we need to ask, if we are ambassadors, how do we advocate for the unborn? What do we do? What do we say? How do we act? Well, that question is massive, and we don't have time to fully answer that. So let's pick one avenue that we potentially could use, and that would be the use of graphic images. Graphic images to get people's attention, to foster compassion for what's happening in our country today. There's a long history of using graphic images in the area of rhetoric. Wilberforce had commissioned a seal, and the seal was a picture of an African chained, and it simply said, "Am I not a man? Am I not your brother?" Very powerful that people saw that and caused them to stop and think about the issue. It was also used in the civil rights movement. When the civil rights movement was just starting, just gaining momentum, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old African-American boy, allegedly flirted with a white female cashier while he was buying bubble gum. That night he was dragged out of his home, was beaten to death, and thrown into a river. His mother made a heroic decision, and that is when they fished her son's body out of the river, he was bloated, disfigured, and she decided to have an open casket funeral. And this is what she said: "Let the world see what has happened, because there is no way I can describe this." So I'm going to warn you, the image you're going to see is both Emmett when he was alive and the open casket. It is gruesome to watch, so feel freedom not to watch. But here is what it looked like. That picture, particularly in Jet magazine, swept the country. It literally stopped people to talk about it. What is happening that a 14-year-old boy has this kind of treatment going to buy bubble gum? And it was the start, really, of the civil rights movement. Some have even said that this motivated the key leaders of the civil rights movement in their opposition. So the question becomes, this is hard, obviously, to describe, and the mother said, "You must see it." So I think images can help us both understand the knitting together of a fetus in a mother's womb that Dr. Ray was talking about in very positive ways. For example, look at these wonderful photos at 8 weeks, at 10 weeks. Look at the handiwork of God. Look at 27 weeks. And you can see that knitting happening in the womb of a mother. Take a look at 5 months. It's incredibly powerful. It stops us in our tracks, right? What we take for granted, that there's a life inside of a mother. We actually can now see it because of advancements in fetal photography. But what can also show the positive aspect of it can tragically show the negative aspect of it. The problem with the word abortion is often it's a symbol that we don't attach much personality to the word. What fetal photography can also do is show us the horrors of abortion, and we see what these abortions actually look like. And I think there's a place for that. The second president of World Vision was often criticized by showing us what starving children actually look like. And his comment was this: this is not emotionalism. It would be wrong for us not to be emotional as you watch a child starve. No, we need to show these photographs, and it ought to evoke emotion in us. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you these same images, but I'll show you roughly corresponding what the abortion looks like. I will warn you, this is heartbreaking to watch. So I'm going to play music. When the music starts, the images will start. There is no shame whatsoever looking away or closing your eyes. So when the music is done, you can open your eyes. So let's watch these. I'll confess that I often forget what's happening in this country. We've grown up in the land of Roe v. Wade, and I often forget the horror of it. And watching photographs like that stops me dead in my tracks. God never forgets. He sees every abortion, he's crafted every fetus, and he thinks about this all the time, and it breaks his heart. It ought to break our heart as communicators, as people representing God. This ought to break our hearts. Now listen, let me just say this. If you've had an abortion, God's forgiveness is as deep as the graphic nature of those images. Paul says in Romans chapter 8, there is no condemnation for you because you are forgiven. He will later say that you're justified, and in that justification, in Christ Jesus, you have peace. You're not a second-class Christian citizen. And Dr. Anderson is going to talk more about that at the end of our presentation. So I think these images are incredibly powerful in-house, like a Biola or a church, to motivate us to engage the public. But we must think about this. When we engage the public, what is the role of these images? Right? Here, it is totally appropriate to show these. But in the public square, where we seek to persuade people, what is the role of graphic images? There's no easy answer to that question from a rhetorical standpoint. Let me give you a test case. When I was in grad school, a group came to UNC Chapel Hill that showed these graphic images. It had two results that I found very interesting. One, it poured gasoline on the culture war. It made people incredibly angry. And what happened was the focus shifted from the unborn to the mode of communication. People were furious that you would show those images on campus. No one talked about the unborn. And if we make the complex argument that abortion is genocide, then that is a complex argument that may or may not be able to be made. But when people see the images in which you might say in print, no, this is genocide. This is what the Nazis did to the Jews. That is a complex argument, but people see the images very quickly and linking those images together, and it produced anger. People were furious. Second observation, it actually silenced the pro-life people. Oddly enough, it didn't embolden them, it silenced us. Why? Because you couldn't talk about the issue on campus. I'd say for a year you couldn't talk about it. Every time you brought up the issue, they would go right back to those images. How dare you tell me that a woman walking into a clinic is like a Nazi killing a Jew? How dare you? And the heat was so hot rhetorically, you just didn't go near that topic because you couldn't. The communication climate inadvertently had become so toxic, you couldn't bring up this issue. Am I saying there's no place for graphic images? I'm not saying that in the public square, but we must practice what communication scholars call feed forward, which is anticipate the effects of your rhetoric. Anticipate the communication climate you're going to create. The top UN negotiator who is currently trying to broker peace in Syria's civil war said this, and I just read this in the paper. He said, "You may win the battle for an hour in mediation, but you'll lose the week. You may win the conversation at that moment, but you'll lose an entire week because what has happened between you and the very person you seek to persuade is a toxic communication climate has been fostered." Some would argue, I'll take the hour, I'll take the day, and lose the week. I don't think we can do that as communicators. I think we need to always ask the question, what is the kind of communication climate we are creating by our rhetoric? Because we do want to persuade people. Paul would say, no, in the fear of the Lord we seek to persuade people. So understand the rule of reciprocation. Generally speaking, people treat you like you treat them. That's why I'm so pleased that our Center for Christian Thought this next year is going to tackle the topic of civility. We cannot just ditch civility. Peter would say, give a reason for your hope, but do it with gentleness and respect. This is a tough issue, certainly not being able to be resolved in one chapel service, but we must think deeply about the use of graphic images. I applaud our president, who promised that he would come out with a statement on graphic images, and in fact did, and said this: I do see room for graphic images on this campus where you can speak your mind through heartbreaking images. So you can get graphic images approved on this campus, and it will be in Sutherland Way. They will periodically be in that part of campus. They'll have to be pre-approved, right? But then these images can be shown because we need constant reminders of what breaks God's heart every single day. Dr. Anderson.
So far today, we've heard about why the issue of abortion is important. We've been shown the statistics, and we've seen the images. The world tells us that abortion is about decisions, rights, and timing, but all that has been shared thus far today has maybe opened our eyes to the truth, or at least caused us to reconsider the littlest victims, the unborn members of our human community, as Dr. Ray put it. And while we contemplate this, I would like to suggest that we don't stop there. I ask that you consider the plight of those left behind, the ones impacted by the decision to abort. Our hearts are stirred by images of babies, while our anger is often channeled into blame at the survivors. But the survivors, the decision makers, are not left unscathed. For every one research study that claims no after effects for women who choose to abort their babies, there is another one that documents the post-traumatic symptoms, anxiety disorders, clinical depression, and vicarious trauma family members that can follow a decision to abort. Regardless of whether or not post-abortion symptoms reach clinical levels, no one disputes the fact that abortion changes you. In her book entitled Changed, Making Sense of Your Own or a Loved One's Abortion Experience, Michaeline Fredenberg presents the stories of a wide range of people impacted by abortion, or what I like to say, the ones who live on. Maybe it's the woman who keeps track of how old her child would have been as she marks the due date given to her by her OBGYN all those years ago. Or as a client of my own once said through her tears in a session, "You know, Tammy, what people don't realize is that I am a mom. I'm just a mom of a dead baby." Or what about the boyfriend who was truthfully just as scared as his girlfriend at the prospect of teen parenthood, who stated, "I thought I was helping my girlfriend by encouraging her to have an abortion." I had another client who I had seen for some time was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and she was the third member of her family to be diagnosed. And the statistics were high, the percentages, that her child would also suffer. And she came in, married, and said, "I'm trying to decide what to do. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's fair." Dr. Muehlhoff mentioned the complexity with which women approach these decisions. And that's an example. Thoughtful mom to be, wondering if it was the best for her child to even be born. Or maybe it was the belief that life would continue as if nothing ever happened. That's a common misperception. Living in denial, possibly making a decision to end another pregnancy down the line. The denial just grows and grows to allow a woman to move to the next abortion. Sometimes parents encourage their children to abort because they imagine all the lost opportunities that will limit their child, only to find that they too cannot get past the abortion. Maybe the baby is seen as a necessary sacrifice for the kingdom, so the father or mother can move on with God's work. Or maybe the decision is more about maintaining the picture of ourselves that we want others to see, that we want to project to the world, the false self, someone who has made good decisions and is above blame. As you ponder these stories, I hope you grasp that these are stories of real people, both believers and non-believers. The statistics would tell us that there could possibly be 50 women in this room today who made a decision to abort. Maybe a student, we think of typically. What about a staff member or faculty who made this decision? We don't know. As we think about the impact of abortion on those that live on, I ask you to consider how you will respond when faced with such a disclosure. I ask that you consider a response marked by compassion. Compassion to suffer with the ones left behind, and compassion for those who are maybe feeling panicked and finding themselves pregnant and contemplating what was previously considered just unthinkable, but in the moment seems like maybe it's the decision to make, to abort their baby. Compassion as modeled by Christ and hopefully reflected through his people. As we conclude, I'm aware that some of you here today may need some counsel to help you think and feel through what has been shared or what you have seen today. I encourage you to find a trusted mentor, friend, family member to share with. Some of you may find professional counseling helpful as you wrestle with what you've heard today. I encourage you to seek out the help that you need. But today, in this moment, we can ask God to move us toward compassion for those who are hurting. Okay. As the talk's been going on today, I've seen people grab each other's hands, hugs given, stories untold in this very room, people who have been touched by abortion. On the screen, you will find a few prayer prompts that might guide you as you consider those left behind. I'm going to ask that you take a moment to pray silently maybe using one of the prompts listed above. And then after a bit, I will close us in prayer. Let's take a moment. See what God brings to your mind.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.